such, and we want to understand them as such so that we can respect them as such. Now, there's this question of, okay, we're not lumping religions all together, but are there religious universals? There is, I believe, a universal need for religion. And there is this universal premise that everyone who has a religion, and I think every human being, looks at the world and says, something isn't right. Now, what's not right, what they decide isn't right about the world, is different. Um, for those who talk about atheism being a religion, they look at the world, or the new atheism looks at the world and say, religion isn't right, or a belief in God isn't right, or a belief in a deity isn't right. That's what's wrong with humanity. Maybe is how they would answer that question about something isn't right. But they feel that something isn't right, and we need to find a solution to that wrong, or that evil, or that suffering, or that death. This is just something very sociological about human beings. We do that all the time, whether it be in society or in religion. We build and externalize a society, and then we objectify that society. So we create that society, we shape it as human beings, and then we see it as something we didn't create. It's as if it just existed, and we understand ourselves within that framework. So we create a system that brings law and order out of the chaos that is life that we see. That the something isn't right is kind of the chaos, and so we build an order, a society, a culture, or a belief system to protect ourselves from that something isn't right thing, whether that be suffering, evil, death, or whatever problem that a religion puts forth. It becomes a religion when we start to reflect that order onto the cosmos, where we start to say, this isn't only how my community works, or my family works, or my country works. This is how the world works, or this is how the universe works. Okay, so understand that. That's kind of what every religion does. Is something isn't right. How do we protect ourselves from that something isn't right? And then if it's the case that we're protecting ourselves from this something isn't right, then it probably is the case that everyone should protect themselves from the something isn't right through this system of law and order. That's something put forward by Peter Berger. Um, he has a book called The Sacred Canopy. If you'd like to read that book, it is certainly an intellectual journey with Peter Berger. He's a very smart man, and he uses a lot of smart man words. So if you're interested in reading that book, it is a great read. It is certainly not something you want to try and read at midnight because you will fast fall asleep. But saying this, saying that all these religions have kind of a shared foundation, isn't to say that they have one essence that they share. Instead, they share kind of family resemblances, whether it's a nose or the hair or whatever it is. We always can tell when someone is related to someone else by the way they look. You look just like your grandma, or you just look like Aunt Maria, or whatever it may be. And so, too, we can look at religions and say they're not all the same, but they do share some family resemblances. And that's why we can study religion and we can kind of look at them together, because we can say, now look, this religion is similar to this religion in this way. Now, that's not to say they're the same or that they share the same essence, the same idea, but it's interesting that two different religions developed in two different parts of the world kind of came to the same idea about how to do things. You may see this with fasting. Fasting is one of those things you see in a lot of religions. And it basically physically is the same, but the end goal may be different. So it's a resemblance, like I've got my dad's nose, but it's not the same nose, if you get what I'm talking about. It's not the same essence, but it is a resemblance. Now, as we move forward to actually study these religions, a few kind of codas as we go in. A friend of mine, Gonapudi, was sharing with me as we talked about this class. He says, be sure that we study world religions, not discuss them. You can discuss world religions and then you can study them. We're going to take a study of them. We're not just going to talk about what we think about other religions. We're not just going to talk about what we see from other religions. That will be part of it. That's the discussion part of our study. But we also want to study them. We want to study them systematically, and we want to study them in depth. So we don't want to just go a mile wide and an inch deep. We want to go a mile deep, if we will, into these religions and really study them, really try to understand them as they are. There's also a difference between studying religions comparatively and apologetically or polemically. We can study religions and compare them, study religions and look at them as they are, and then we can do as many Christians do, study them apologetically or polemically, which is to say, study those things about the religion that are not right and that we disagree with, and then train people to disagree with them in a cogent, coherent way. Uh, we will do some of that in that class. There will be times where we talk about how to witness to people of another faith, because this is a Christian's study of religions. But as we do that, we're going to minimize that part, because before we go and witness to someone, I think it's really of great value to study them in depth and to understand those religions really well before we go and witness to them. So, as we do this study, it's not a polemic study, it's not an apologetic study, in so much as we're going to look at a faith, say Hinduism, and say, well, this is what's wrong about Hinduism, and this is how you're going to talk to people about what's wrong with Hinduism, so you can tell them what's right with Christianity. That's not what we're going to do. We'll spend some time on that, and we can talk about those things, and we can discuss some of those things. But really, the bulk of this class will be to study, well, this is what Hinduism is. This is what Hinduism says isn't right with the world. This is what they say you can make it right with. And saying that, what are the ways that they try to make it right? How is it that they try to solve the problem? Um, then we can talk about, well, how is this different from what we believe? Okay, that's kind of what we're going to focus on in this class. There's a time and a place for kind of apologetics and polemics. This class really isn't it. So what we're going to do instead is a friendly study of the world's religions. And Mahatma Gandhi, not a Christian, a guy who said, I like your Jesus, I don't like your Christians, or something like that, said the friendly study of the world's religions is a most sacred duty. And so I think we can kind of import that quote and agree with that to say we're going to study these religions in depth, but do so in a friendly way, where we're not trying to tear them down immediately. We're not trying to disagree with them immediately. Again, argument and disagreement are fine, but let's learn about them. Let's just listen to learn before we open our mouths to talk. And I think that's a sacred thing. I think that's something that is a good thing. It's something that God and Christ would agree with, to understand others before we talk against them. Now, as we do so, there's a lot of different ways you can study world religions. You can compare them. You can consider their historical origins, or look how they developed throughout history. You can study them in a convergent manner. You can look at their theoretical, practical, and sociological expressions, which we will do. We will look at the theoretical expressions, kind of their doctrines. We'll look at their practical expressions, how they live out those doctrines, and then we'll also look at their sociological um, expressions, who they live out these doctrines with and how they shape themselves around their doctrines. But we'll also be following Stephen Prothro's method as put out in his book, God is Not One. In his book, he looks at each religion and says each religion poses a problem, that something isn't right, and then they propose a solution to that problem. And then they have this technique, which is to say, well, how does this solution solve that problem? And there's always an exemplar. There's always someone who did it first or did it best. And so we are to look to them as an example of how to connect that technique to our solution and problem, and in order to solve the problem of that something isn't right of human existence. So that's how we're going to study the religions, and we'll talk more about that as we do each religion. Each time we study religion, we'll look at a problem, solution, technique, and exemplar. But we'll also, doing that, look at their theoretical, practical, and sociological expressions. And in doing so, we'll look at these kind of 7 family resemblances, you might say, the 7 characteristics that religions tend to share. Again, not the same essence, but a family resemblance that they share. Each religion has a sacred idea. It's kind of their doctrinal element. Or they have sacred texts, which is kind of their narrative or story that drives them, that gives them undergirding. They have sacred spaces, which is like the material element of their belief system, whether it be a temple or a church or a synagogue or a river or a mountain. There's sacred time, which is kind of a ritual element. For Christians that might be Sunday. For Jews it might be the Shabbat, from Friday at sundown to Saturday at sundown. Or for Muslims that might be Ramadan, a holy month. Okay, they're sacred people. A pastor is different than the laity in a Christian church, or an imam is different than um, the rest of the masjid, or the rest of the people that come to the mosque, although the imam is not a set thing, as we'll talk more about when we talk about Islam. Or a Hindu renunciate or a Buddhist monk is different, and they're kind of seen as sacred. So we'll talk about these sacred people, which tend to institutionalize themselves. This is best seen in the Roman Catholic Church, a very institutional religious organization, where the Pope is a sacred person, and there's an institution that forms itself around that sacred person, the Pope. They're also